Sam Blackburn is a real person who has had one of the most terrifying experiences throughout his life that I've ever heard. In this episode, I will take you back to the beginning and share the most terrifying series of true events I've ever told. I'm not gonna lie, it's very dark, very powerful, but man, it is one heck of a journey. You will not want to miss this one. Before we begin, there's a lot of information and there will be a lot of jumping around in time to make sense of events, so please bear with me. In the early 1970s, Sam Blackburn and his family lived in central Long Island, New York. At this time, he was just a little guy, no more than 4 or 5 years old, and he was also the youngest of 6 and had 5 older sisters. The family lived in a modest one-level home with just an attic and a basement. Growing up, his house was very chaotic, but like any middle-class family, they tried their best to hold things together. One day, Sam's step-grandparents came to visit. They hadn't seen the family in a while and spent a few hours sitting around the living room and catching up drinking coffee. But before leaving, they pulled his eldest sisters aside and gave them a special gift. Now, this gift was so special that Sam's parents weren't allowed to know about it. So after the grandparents said their goodbyes and left, the sisters took it down to the basement. This gift was to be hidden and to be taken very good care of. Because Sam had 5 other siblings, there were obviously not enough bedrooms on the first level, so a few of his sisters lived in the basement, where their bedrooms were. And being teenagers at the time, his sisters appreciated the privacy. In one of the rooms, 2 of the sisters shared a bedroom and had twin beds at each end. This will make sense in just a moment. However, over the coming months, they started not enjoying the basement as much as they used to. They would feel this increasing negative energy filling the room and sometimes seeing shadows moving along the wall. One night, around 3 in the morning, one of the sisters in the shared bedroom woke up to a loud banging. They always kept a nightlight on, and when the sister looked over, she could clearly see her other sister partially lifted in bed. Some invisible force had its hands gripped on both sides of her head, violently slamming it back and forth against the wall. The sister, witnessing this, screamed and ran to get their mom. Their father wasn't home since he worked as an over-the-road truck driver, and their mom just grabbed a candle and her Bible and rushed downstairs. By the time she got there, the attack had stopped. Both sisters were crying. The mother sat on their bed and spoke to them for quite a while when the sisters finally confessed. The gift their step-grandmother had given them was in fact a Ouija board that they had been using. Their mom was angry and demanded where the girls hid the board. After finding it, she destroyed it and threw it in the trash, but not before reading several Bible passages and praying for protection over the room. The girls had a rough night of sleep after that. And this, folks, is the true beginning of when things changed in that home. What had once been a relatively peaceful, loving household suddenly felt like all hell had broken loose. Things would go missing or get moved around. The sisters started having explosive fights over bizarre accusations, and the girls often got into violent, turbulent altercations, sometimes attacking each other with objects. Additionally, the girls would suffer from physical, emotional, and psychological abuse from their mother. The father would often come home and would be ridden with jealousy and accuse the mom of having an affair. And somehow, some way, he had a drastic personality shift, and as time went on, the fights between Sam's mother and father got increasingly violent. One in particular is when Sam's mom attacked his dad and he needed stitches. Things were different back then with the laws, so his dad was able to get the charges dropped. But this kind of chaos was a very common theme in the house. There were nights when their father got so drunk he would shoot bullets on the main level of the home, or nights when the fighting got so bad Sam was ushered out his window in just his underwear in the middle of winter and told to go get help from the neighbors. On this particular event, he had spent all night on the neighbor's back doorstep since they never woke up to let him in. In the chaos, his family had forgotten about him until morning. Somehow, he survived without any side effects like frostbite. At some point during this time, one of his oldest sisters had a child out of wedlock. and wanting to make things right and be a family, married the father, and they stuck it out for quite a while. Her own father, Sam's dad, absolutely hated this man, and one evening, he had drunk a little too much, and after pulling out his gun, aimed and shot at his daughter and barely missed. Now, Sam, who was only 9 years old at this time, was miraculously able to talk his dad down. The police were called, and when they arrived, they were going to take his father, but Sam's mother bailed him out. And because of Sam's father's job, he had often had trucker friends over to stay the night instead of a hotel. And one night, one of these friends came to stay in the basement. Around midnight, they all woke to the man screaming at the top of his lungs. Suddenly, they all heard this pounding, this pum, 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 which was him running up the stairs like a stampeding elephant. This huge, strong man, built like a flipping refrigerator, Perry in denim overalls, easily 6'4", close to 400 pounds, just a huge dude, had eyes bigger than quarters. When he emerged, he didn't stop to chat, and in a panic, he told everyone he was leaving immediately and that he would rather sleep in his truck than spend another second in that basement. Now, before he walked out the door, Sam's father talked to him and calmed him down momentarily enough to get an answer out of him. This man woke up to a large, dark shadow strangling him in his bed, and for several moments, he was convinced he was going to die, but fortunately, he was able to break free. He never stayed at their house again. One sister stayed and never had any problems down there, though her outer appearance changed. She became moody and started wearing all black, constantly rebelling and fighting. While most of these events were contained in this home, there was one day in particular when Sam believes it followed him to school. Until this point, it was just an ordinary school day. During recess in 5th grade, he was running at full speed toward the door when suddenly, a strong, unseen force held his right foot down, and he went sailing into the wall to the right of the classroom door. He seized up and couldn't breathe. He thought he was going to die. The principal and nurse ran in, telling him to breathe repeatedly, rubbing his chest and telling him to relax. Eventually, he caught his breath and was carried to the nurse's room. When his mom arrived, they told her he had ripped a muscle in his lower left back, but should fully recover since he was young. He still has a dent in that area to this day. As time went into the 1980s, his father moved with Sam to Florida to develop their homestead, which had about 24 acres of raw forested land. His mother would stay up north for another couple of years, waiting for her transfer to an insurance company job before renting out their house. They did not want to lose money, so when it came time, they rented out through various people over the years. Eventually, one of the older sisters, Tiffany, decided to rent it. She and her husband had separated at the time, so it was just her and her children. But because she couldn't afford all the rent, one of the other sisters, Janelle, and her husband moved in as well. Unfortunately, there was still too much chaos and arguing, so Tiffany moved out. It ended up working out though, because Janelle and her husband and their 3 kids really liked having the house to themselves. If any of you have dealt with a roommate, which most of us have, it's not always great to share your living space. They lived relatively peaceful and uneventful lives, but not everything was perfect. Eventually, the chaos that had consumed her family and her parents almost 20 years prior was starting to rear its head again. They would get into physical altercations and attacking each other with objects. There was even one incident where Janelle had snuck up on her husband and knocked him out cold with a 2x4. Now, despite the violence, things still weren't as turbulent as they had been during her upbringing. That energy fueling all this chaos still resided in the home. And whatever it was, folks, it had no intention of leaving. Now, down in Florida in the mid-1980s, Sam at this point was roughly a 12-year-old boy, and he was really starting to enjoy the change of life. They had moved into a used, single-wide manufactured home the father had already set up. Plans to eventually build a bigger house and move the current one to the back of the property to rent out. Sam's father had always been very loving and affectionate toward his son. After coming home from long trucking routes, he often brought his boy gifts and toys. Having prayed for years for a son after having daughter after daughter, he really cherished his boy, who came along 7 years after his last daughter. And this new location's different family dynamic was brightening things up. The parents got along better, and everything appeared fine. The land needed extensive work to tame. Sam spent every spare hour outside school, church, and sleep working that property. Since his father had a bad back from years of unloading and fixing trucks, his son became the primary muscle for most tasks. And so, about 6 months after arriving, things began to change. A heaviness descended on the property, an oppressive, suffocating feeling in the air. Initially dismissed as the Florida heat, the feeling persisted throughout the colder months. The family eventually started an animal farm on the property. Everything appeared normal, but not long after, animals started dropping like flies. It was especially traumatic for a teenager from up north with no experience in farming. In fact, all Sam seemed to do was clear trees his father had cut down, dodge coral and rattlesnakes, and bury animals in the back of their property. Their chickens, despite being well fed, would constantly attack and cannibalize each other. The rabbits, though properly sheltered, would develop these awful skin diseases and perish, or if not separated, maul each other. Strangely, the pigs would break out and devour the chickens whole. The boy even saw them catch and eat snakes. The goats would often get sick, letting out pained bleats and death rattles before succumbing to their illness. There's more that involves goats, cows, and horses, but due to how graphic it is, we'll just say that many of them got sick and died. And during all of this chaos, Sam started experiencing sleep paralysis, something that had never happened up north. Sometimes, an unseen force would hold him face down in bed. Other times, he'd wake in panic to see dark, shadow-like figures lurking in the corners of his room. During this period, his father's personality shifted dramatically. The loving, affectionate man disappeared, replaced by someone mean and cruel. He stopped attending church, forcing his son to get rides from another family to attend Sunday services. The father's behavior grew increasingly erratic and violent. Just really horrific stuff. His father often forced Sam to participate in many things to make a man out of him. Though Sam learned to shut off his emotions and did what he was ordered, he never enjoyed it like his father seemed to. His dad just had a liking for cruelty, blood, and killing. This part is wild. One night, Sam dreamt about a pig getting loose and his father wildly shooting at it in the woods. In the dream, something moved him to jump behind the chicken coop, saving him from getting hit by buckshot. Well, a week later, it happened exactly as he had dreamed. And so one day, his father's dog got loose and slaughtered his mother's prized white ducks. You know how it is on farm life. The mom didn't kill the dog, but instructed Sam to handle business. He unfortunately had no choice. When his father later arrived home, he was so furious he shot up the backyard. From there, it seemed like his father would continue to decline mentally. Hours later, long after Sam had fallen asleep, he woke up to commotion from his father in the living room. After going out to investigate, he could see his dad was clearly on the verge of losing it, with a rifle in his hands. After very serious and violent threats made to him, his mother, and Sam, somehow having the ability to remain calm, just told his dad that God wouldn't let him do that. Please go back to his room. His father lowered the weapon and returned to his room. Now by this point, his parents slept separately. While one extreme situation had been diffused, the circumstances surrounding the living situation were about to worsen. Sam faced tremendous and horrific physical, emotional, and psychological abuse from both parents. It's so extreme that I won't be going into detail. This sort of life became Sam's normal. And over the years, his father would explode over nothing. They would get into intense physical altercations, using weapons and anything they could. After some time, the father started to reek of sulfur, and sometimes Sam would see his father's eyes go completely black and his face shift into something else. Sam was convinced that the land they had lived on was cursed. Great evil existed there, and he felt it constantly. At 16, Sam had finally had enough of the life he had endured until now. He made an attempt at the unthinkable, but managed to survive. That year, he got baptized, and even though the abuse left him feeling numb inside, he felt an inner glow knowing something greater loved and protected him. After his baptism, it wasn't as bad, and he didn't feel it when he was off the property. He simply learned to cope. He learned not to love or have pets since he lost so many. Disturbingly, the evidence showed they weren't the only ones suffering. Lots of people had similar problems with their animals. There was rampant drug use and death that got swept under the carpet and ignored by the community. Strange illnesses seemed to plague the area, like lupus, cancer, leukemia, all kinds of mental illness. Even a woman at Sam's church developed this bizarre hardening of the skin disease. Sam's close friend from school, who was older than him, died of leukemia at age 23, and there were many others. Historically speaking, that area had supposedly been hexed by Native Americans who had survived the wars against them in that land. The region witnessed extensive fighting between Seminole tribes and U.S. forces, with Seminoles fighting 3 major wars to retain their lands. The area also saw action during the Civil War, though Florida's involvement was less extensive than other Confederate states. The combination of these conflicts and forced relocations left a lot of negative energy and trauma to the land and the people who inhabited it. Sam was at a point in his life where he just couldn't take it any longer, and he realized after one final argument with his father, he needed out. One day, he just got up and left and joined the army. The turmoil didn't just exist between Sam and his father, though. His parents would later divorce after his father had an affair with a woman who was diagnosed with AIDS. Sam's mother called him up while he was in training and completely broke down, saying that this was the final straw. She would have to get tested and pray everything would be okay. The news shattered Sam's focus on the military. He often got into fights and nearly became the victim of a Full Metal Jacket blanket party, which he had witnessed happen to a Texan who eerily resembled Private Pyle from the film. Though he had been doing well and scoring high, a freak accident with a grenade exploding nearby, which a small barrier saved his life, and another bad incident gave him severe PTSD. This is when he began drinking and smoking heavily, leaving the base without permission. Eventually, he met with JAG, which are military legal officers, and opted to get out early. During all these years, Sam kept in contact with his sisters, and he would go up north to their home in New York to visit Janelle, who lived in the home with her children and husband, and there was one visit in particular that really bothered Sam. He was sitting down in the living room one morning, having a cup of coffee and chatting with his nephew, and during the conversation, Sam couldn't help but notice how engrossed his nephew was in drawing. His nephew always loved to draw, so this wasn't abnormal. Sam set his cup down, walked over to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and just asked, "Hey buddy, what are you drawing?" But before the sentence could formulate in his mouth, he saw what was being drawn. Pictures of demons with horns like a goat. I mean, we all know that kids draw stuff, but he had never seen his nephew draw anything like this. Rightfully concerned, he just asked his nephew why he had drawn those. Sam could only assume that maybe he had dreamt them because, as it turns out, the bedroom that the nephew slept in was the same bedroom Sam slept in as a child, and he too had horrific nightmares of what his nephew was drawing. On another visit during Thanksgiving in the early 2000s, he was visiting at the dinner table, letting his meal settle, when his niece told him there was something very evil dwelling in the house. One night, she awakened to see an ink-black figure coming out of her closet with red eyes. She said she closed her eyes and prayed, and when she reopened them, it was gone. And guess where her room was? In the basement. She never had too many problems after that though, so she stayed down there and made a nice home of it like an apartment. She was a special girl with a glow all her own, the kind that's not just beautiful on the outside, but a beautiful pure heart. She sometimes caught shadows moving around her room, but it remained benign. Nothing ever tried to attack her, and eventually, she would marry young but continuously run into fertility issues. After extensive testing, everything was normal. After 10 long years of nothing and praying to God, she finally got pregnant with a baby girl. Interestingly, according to many African legends, the presence of certain kinds of evil spirits can cause barrenness, which was a possible spiritual cause. During the time that Sam left for the military, his older sister Tiffany moved onto the Florida property. Life was everything but peaches and cream. They experienced nothing but turmoil. All of their pets either died or vanished or were ridden with some strange disease. One evening, Tiffany was awakened to a strange sensation in her bedroom. As she woke up and looked towards the ceiling, she saw this smoky shadow apparition gliding across her bedroom ceiling. Before she could scream, it stopped. It looked at her and smiled with what appeared to be serrated teeth and glowing red, cat-like slitted eyes. This was only one of several terrifying experiences she had on that property, and she was thoroughly convinced an abundance of spirits resided there. On another evening, she woke to find a fully dressed Union soldier in blue standing at attention near her bed, holding a rifle. Startled by what she was seeing, it spoke to her and explained, "I'm here to protect you, ma'am. Everything is okay. You can go back to sleep." She hid under her blanket and eventually fell back asleep. Shortly after, Sam returned to the property to help his mother after everything had gone to hell in a handbasket. His primary purpose for returning this time was to help his father relocate to a new property, and at some point during this process, his parents got into a really bad argument, and he just saw the blood in his father's eyes. His father was so furious, he went for his loaded gun and made some very serious threats to his mother. Sam quickly got her off the property before he returned. Sam returned and successfully managed to calm his father down after an hour. This was when his father opened up about everything for the first time. He admitted to Sam that something like a serpent had coiled inside him. He explained that drugs and alcohol helped keep it from springing up into his head and taking over. In that state, he could see what he was doing, but felt like he was on autopilot in a nightmare and could not stop. In fact, his father, who had moved off the property, continued to threaten Sam's mother repeatedly until Sam could not take it anymore. He marched right over to his father's home and told him straight to his face that if he went through with his threats and hurt his mother, he would take his father out himself. Now this scared him because he had never seen his son like that, and it must have worked because all the threats stopped after this, and there wasn't much of a relationship at all after that. On February 6th, 2006, his father died an old, sickly, foul-smelling man who could barely avoid urinating on himself at the age of 66. Unfortunately, he wasn't discovered right away. On February 9th, 3 days later, Tiffany hadn't heard from him, which wasn't normal since he usually returned her phone calls. She sent her husband to go to his house and do a wellness check. Once at his property, he knocked on the door but couldn't hear anything. So after letting himself in, he was greeted with a horrific sight. When the husband went to check on him and pulled back the covers, the father's face peeled off and stuck to the blanket. The body was bloated and discolored, with maggots spilling out all over the bed. He ran outside and vomited. After the family met for the funeral, Tiffany and her husband began arguing constantly, and it felt as if Sam somehow got roped into it. And by this point, he had been out of the military and had become a truck driver. And there is one incident where Tiffany's husband was just going off about something. It had gotten so bad that Tiffany called Sam, and he had to go over there to try to reason with him. When he got out of his vehicle and walked up to the door to knock, some invisible force struck him very hard in his weak spot, a spot where he had almost broken his back years before. The hit was so intense that it felt like electricity shooting up his legs and body. He just dropped to his knees, grabbing the car handle to avoid falling face first in the dirt, and he cried out, "Oh God!" but saw nothing behind him. And so after a quick prayer, he could stand and walked as the pain subsided. Now he wanted to leave, but he felt compelled to follow through with helping his sister. And when the husband answered the door, he stuck his face in Sam's face, laughing with ink-black eyes and babbling in some unknown language. After his insane laughter and apparent mocking, he just turned around, went to the kitchen, and got a drink from the fridge. It was totally nonchalant, as if nothing had happened. Sam began to ask if he was okay, to which the husband responded by turning around, looking at him oddly, and asking him, when did he get here? After that, Sam left and didn't continue much of a relationship with his sister. He would occasionally visit her, and every time he did, he noticed that their room smelt more and more like their father's before he died. Tiffany's husband even began lining up his personal items, cigarettes, lighters, change, on his dresser and night table, just like Sam's father used to do. Was it the actual entity in his father that had now taken hold of Tiffany's husband? We don't know. Now at this point, this portion of the story takes place roughly between 2004 and 2015. Sam had just gotten through a divorce and was staying with a family in Florida before buying a home in Summerfield. The house was a yellow building with a separate garage in the back, sitting on about a half-acre of land in a wooded neighborhood that mostly had dirt roads. It had been built by an old man from up north in a northern style, complete with an attic, red brick foundation, and get this, even a basement with a double storm door side entrance, which again, folks, is very rare in Florida. So when Sam moved in, the air inside felt nippy compared to the outside. I mean, especially in the basement, which had this kind of dank feel and a moldy old man smell. He often felt like he was being watched, seeing shadow figures out of the corner of his eyes, but every time he looked, there was never anything there. Now, as time passed, Sam always felt unwelcome in his own home. It was this feeling he couldn't shake, and the place started having serious pest problems. He was dealing with rats the size of his foot, huge cockroaches called palmetto bugs in Florida, and even termites. Even after getting the pest situation under control through extermination, the feeling never disappeared. Later, Sam found out the previous owner had gotten into a bad situation with her husband and was divorcing him, claiming abuse. She had even slandered him at their church after finding a bunch of porn on his computer. The stress apparently triggered a massive heart attack, causing him to die right there in the house. After learning this, Sam looked up some books about spiritual problems and found one that really helped him, Prepare for War by Dr. Rebecca Brown. He decided to try his first spiritual house cleansing. He went through all the rooms with a Bible and candle in hand, praying and asking that any evil be removed, even opening closets and cabinets. When Sam got to the last room, the temperature suddenly dropped dramatically. Even though it was typical hot Florida weather outside, it got so cold in that room he could see his breath. Then, this force or energy started enveloping him while he tried to pray. It was channeling the most intense negative emotions he had ever felt: hopelessness, despair, anger, hatred, and intense sadness all at once. Though it brought him to tears and his teeth were chattering, he forced himself to complete the prayer 7 times despite having to temporarily stop due to the attack. Suddenly, the whole room changed, brightening and warming up like something had jerked whatever it was straight up to the ceiling and tossed it away from the house. Sam was elated. He finished by taking olive oil he had prayed over to be blessed and anointed the 4 corners of the windows and door frames. After that, things seemed to normalize. One night, while on a walk, Sam saw this incredible star moving across the sky, making him wonder if an angel had been watching him. What seemed like a miracle happened after he anointed the property lines. A brush fire broke out from the empty, overgrown lot behind his land. The fire went in a perfect square around the property without ever crossing the lines before leaving it alone. Afterward, trees grew along those property lines. Some people told him that link angels holding hands around the house caused this. Sam had other weird experiences in the area too. Something Sam really enjoyed doing at this time was going on night walks because of how much shade there was. One evening in late summer, early fall, as he was walking, he looked up at the stars and noticed that one of them had started to move. It was in the middle of the sky, but lower towards the north horizon, the direction Sam was walking. It gradually moved from left to right and it picked up speed. Suddenly, it did a 90-degree turn without slowing down and then shot upward. All of it happened in a matter of 5 to 10 seconds. Afterward, there was this sort of ripple effect in the sky, and Sam just stood there, stupefied, unsure of what to do or say. Now, during this time, Sam started buying extra bedroom sets and mini refrigerators to rent out rooms. He also let his ex-wife stay there for a short time after she got evicted, which he would later regret. Eventually, he would learn that you can't let evil in if you want to keep evil from your home. Once a place gets tarnished, whatever evil was asked to leave can come back 7 times worse than before. One day, Sam's mom made a surprise visit. She had keys to the house for emergencies, and unknown to Sam's ex-wife, who was there, walked in to find her on a ladder trying to place something in the attic. It turned out to be a hex bag. His ex had a witchcraft book out on the table too, and his mom and ex got into a fierce argument. The result was that everything got trashed, Sam was informed of what had happened, and his ex was sent to stay at her daughter's apartment. Now, over time, Sam encountered many room renters, which was normal when renting rooms. I mean, people come and go all the time, but one particular renter turned out to be a witch. She even had a black cat, which Sam had agreed to without seeing it first. And once he discovered more about her and realized she was a witch, he just decided to wait it out, figuring she would leave eventually. Additionally, the witch didn't seem to like that Sam was Christian. He just got those vibes from her. And during the couple of years she stayed there, weird things started happening. Half a dozen black crows would repeatedly attack the roof over Sam's bed almost every other week. There were often complaints about strange smells mixed with incense coming from her room. Sam would often see large, looming black shadows moving throughout the home, and the smell of sulfur filled it. Everyone in the home was having nightmares. The woman, who was a practicing witch, eventually moved out. After she left, it was like her room was cursed. Every person who rented that room either got sick and moved or died. One man developed diabetes and died from a severe stroke right there in the front yard before the ambulance could take him. Another tenant got cancer and then completely vanished, leaving all his belongings behind. He had a lot of cash from a recent retirement, and Sam later ran into a lady who knew him. She was completely convinced that a woman at the bar had seduced him and probably robbed him with her boyfriend and then dumped him somewhere in the Ocala National Forest, since she had bragged about doing this before. Sam had reported this information to the police, but they seemed completely disinterested. Apparently, that old man used to be a sheriff in South Carolina. Well, the string of bad luck continued. An elderly tenant got sick, and the VA told him his body was no longer producing blood, that he'd have to live off transfusions for the remainder of his life. He eventually left and got better after moving out. Others who stayed had terrible luck. One guy had a nasty breakup involving the police, and then got bitten by a brown recluse spider in the basement, losing half the skin on his backside. Some got arrested for stupid things and lost their room that way, or started arguments with Sam until he had to put them out. The next night, though, after a walk, Sam came home to find a 2.5-foot owl resting on his mailbox, staring at him so intensely it was unnerving. He tried to make light of it by saying, "Hello," in his Jerry Seinfeld voice, but the owl was none too happy. It stayed in the tree all night, harassing him with loud hooting. Another time, he came home from work to find 24 vultures sitting on top of his garage. A buddy of his named Joe had rented from him for years, and the cable guys saw it too. They were all freaked out. 2 women renting rooms saw a shadow of a tall man on the other side of the kitchen window and the window in the back door. They walked through that house into that room, only to find no one there when they checked. Now at this point, Sam started having bad luck too with the relationships. His health, accidents like falling off ladders while patching roofs, pet dogs disappearing, the crows started attacking the roof above his bed in the garage. After a bad fall that really popped his lower disc and spine out of place, he could hardly walk. One day, his mother called, saying she would pray for him at her Bible study group. And that very night, he felt a finger go into his back and push his disc back into place. He could walk fine after that. Now, even though Sam tried to bless the home a couple more times, it didn't seem to work, likely due to the sin among the renters who came and went. He went through more spiritual warfare besides all the issues with his home. This involved his sister Tiffany when she got really sick and was dying, and so that night, Sam did a risky prayer called an In the Gap prayer, where you ask God to use your spirit, your soul, to defend a loved one. That night, when he went to sleep, he saw himself in a white glowing robe with a sword of fire, walking in a dark, dead place with ground like black volcanic rock, moving through a crowd of demons in the darkness, kept at bay only by the light of his robe. He could hear the growling like a chorus. Now, Sam was guided to who he was looking for, a demon about 12-13 feet tall, built like a bodybuilder, with 6 fingers and 6 toes, with claws, skin like green snot, long horns where its ears should be, and a skull face with serrated teeth. He leapt in the air and cut it in half, and it toppled to the ground. When it started to pull itself back together, Sam called out to heaven above, and a bright light came down in a beam focused on this thing. It turned into black goo and sucked into a hole in the ground. Sam woke up that morning covered in sweat, having never experienced anything like that before. It felt so real. When he called about his sister, amazingly, she was awake and was recovering. 2 months later, she got baptized and stopped all the witchcraft. Now back at Sam's house, the final straw was what Sam called succubus attacks, which happened often. When they did, it felt real. Only after shaking himself back to full consciousness did he understand it wasn't real. Still, he was always severely drained, and in one incident in particular, he thought he woke up and was sitting on his bed. His door opened and he saw the silhouette of his ex-wife in the light of the door. She always had a very noticeable figure, and she walked toward him, got into the bed, and he laid down with her. She cuddled up to his back, and he could feel everything. And so he finally half turned to face her, and her face turned out to be an empty hole. He screamed and tried to get up, but she locked onto him like a crab with strength greater than his, all 4 limbs gripping him, while he could feel lots of energy draining out of his lower spine into her body. He tried to turn the side lamp on, but there was no light bulb. He finally cried out to God for help, and suddenly, she was gone, and he snapped up to a sitting position covered in sweat. His sister had always warned that his ex had a dark aura, probably from being involved with a gang execution and who knows what else up in Chicago. She had drunkenly attempted to attack him over the years as well. After recovering from this terrible experience, Sam spent a lot of time researching and eventually found a deliverance pastor, Bill Schnoebelen, with a lot of experience since he used to be deep into the occult in his younger years. And so after finding out more about prayer cleansings, Sam did a prayer specifically asking for soul severance ties and all ties to everyone he's ever slept with, specifically his ex-wife. Afterward, he felt a huge weight lifted off of him. Sam decided to leave the house alone because of the people coming and going, and just focus on blessing his studio apartment and anointing it with blessed oil on all sides, windows, and doors. One morning, he noticed it was so quiet and thought, where are the crows? He looked outside at the back door and saw 6 of them sitting on the branch of a tree just beyond his property line, quiet and reserved and staying away. This seemed to work for some time, but sadly, he still kept getting complaints and bad luck from renters. Eventually, one couple robbed everything from the room and the mini fridge. Sam heard them arguing outside his door just before they left, and even heard a pistol go off. He heard the girl telling the guy, "No," because Sam thought the man was planning to stick him up for his cash since he had just got his weekly payments Friday night, and it was now Saturday morning. Sam stayed inside, quietly waiting, and heard them walk away. He waited a while longer and then got a bat and went to check the house, and they were long gone with all the furnishings. Now at this point, he was done with this place. And by 2014, Sam had met his fiancée in Louisville. By 2015, he was planning to leave. She had this nice townhouse, 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms spread across 2 levels. The first floor had a kitchen, bathroom, and living room, while upstairs held the bedrooms and another bathroom. It was a pretty nice place. At this time, his fiancée was a poet, and Sam wasn't jealous because he understood that meant she was constantly connecting with all sorts of people through social media and at local poetry events. She would host shows on TalkShoe and perform her spoken word poetry at venues around Louisville. She had a charismatic personality, and her creative work attracted unusual people and experiences. Strange things often happened when Sam was with her, odd and sometimes supernatural. But we'll get to that in a moment. After Sam moved in, he began having these weird nightmares. He'd see these huge black-cloaked entities with several winged demons crawling toward him. He'd wake up totally freaked out, and eventually, Sherry admitted that her 14-year-old son, who frequently stayed with his father, had the same problem. They had found a pentagram in his closet, apparently left by previous occupants messing around with witchcraft. Sherry said it was painted over now, and she often prayed at night with her son and put a Bible under his pillow, which stopped his nightmares. Sam began leaving a Bible out on his nightstand and opened to Psalms 23, and usually, his sleep was okay after that, though not always. One day, while Sam was out doing his truck route, making multiple stops and drops, he pulled up to this warehouse in town and had the strangest experience. This man came walking out quickly, almost like a soldier, with authority and confidence. He spoke to Sam like he was a disappointed uncle or a father. He looked at Sam and demanded, what was he doing up here? He wasn't supposed to be up here. Why did he come here? And he just stared at Sam with such disappointment and annoyance. Sam was just like, who is this guy? He'd never seen him before. But somehow this stranger made him feel incredibly guilty. And then the man's voice took on this sad tone as he said he knew exactly why Sam had come up here. It was over a woman, wasn't it? And he just shook his head in disappointment and walked slowly back into the warehouse. The whole interaction had this weird Highway to Heaven Michael Landon vibe. Sam was freaked out. I mean, the man could have been anywhere between 30 to 50 years old, but he was a strong, good-looking, rugged man. But Sam had to go talk to him because he had to go inside to handle the paperwork. Now, the interaction was probably pretty awkward, as I can imagine, and the man just took Sam's documents, signed them, and handed them right back, and the entire time gave Sam this penetrating stare like he could see right through him, never losing that stare of disappointment. And after seeing all the stuff out of the truck get taken out, that was his cue to leave. And after this, Sam began to have more bizarre experiences. Sometimes on his routes, he would see lightning during snowstorms, which was freaky, flooding with interstates completely frozen over. He even had to drive the 119 in Kentucky to the eastern part of the state. And if you've ever driven the 119, you'll know it's sketchy. lots of winding roads, narrow lanes, high cliffs, and steep drop-offs. Now, back at home, things would only get more complicated. Sherry, his fiancée, who is a very attractive woman, and her poetry on Facebook attracts a lot of attention, but it also seems to make her a magnet for weird people. And around this time, she made contact with someone who followed her poetry page on Facebook. He was a well-built, handsome man around their age. Sherry and this man had been messaging back and forth for a while. And even though Sherry was very street smart and worldly, having that natural Chicago hustle about her, she was also a devoted Christian, baptized since she was 11. Now, this new follower had told her he was also a saved Christian. And over time, as they continued talking, the man began to open up more and more to her. She would always share these unusual details with Sam. It was just the kind of relationship they had. But this person seemed to be doing quite well for himself financially. And that's because he traveled and did something pretty important for work, although it wasn't really ever disclosed what. But during one of these trips, this man had gone somewhere in Asia, possibly near Tibet, and it was during these conversations that the man revealed something disturbing. He explained to Sherry that, while in Asia, he had discovered a ritual from an occultist. This ritual could allow someone to shapeshift. The man didn't share the exact details. Still, he made it clear that it was incredibly evil, involving human sacrifice and selling one's soul. He and his friend had decided to go through with the ritual, attracted by the promise of power it would bring, but there's always a very high price to pay for this kind of power. Eventually, it started to consume every aspect of his life. He would kill from time to time, but eventually grew tired of it. He felt like he was losing control of whatever spiritual force he had given himself over to. After searching extensively, he found a deliverance pastor who understood the reality of occult practices and agreed to help him. The man said he went through deliverance and was later baptized by this pastor, but sometimes this darkness and pure rage would build up inside of him, and he would begin transforming into this evil beast. The only thing that could stop it was prayer. With such a claim, Sam's fiancée, Sherry, was completely taken aback by all this. Being of sound mind, she naturally thought this man was just crazy. She didn't believe him and made the mistake of slightly mocking him. And so the man sent a photo and a short recording that scared Sam's fiancée so badly, she immediately showed them to Sam. When he saw the photo and heard the recording, it freaked him out too. Without even having to discuss it, they both knew just from looking at each other's expression that she immediately needed to cut all contact. And looking through the man's Facebook, there were other concerning photos where his eyes looked off, and the way he appeared in weightlifting photos, there was just something not right. Everything suggested he was dangerous and shouldn't be crossed. The photos sent to Sherry showed the man staring intensely into the camera with animalistic eyes that had an unnatural shine, like you'd see in a dog's eyes. His right shoulder appeared stretched from his neck, displaced by about 6 inches. The muscles on that side were grotesquely swollen, like they'd been pumped full of steroids, while his left shoulder remained normal. He was wearing a tank top, so they could see his upper shoulders clearly, and something was wrong. It looked like his body was in the middle of transforming into something inhuman. The recording was worse. It was like someone had taken a deep, guttural wolf growl and somehow mixed it with a man's voice. The man snarled with absolute hatred and disdain in this inhuman voice and asked her, "How dare you mock me? How dare you judge me? Don't ever mock me. Why?" Apparently, they never saw the man again after that. But still, the reality of what they were dealing with, even if he wasn't a genuine shapeshifter, was disturbing to say the least. But this wasn't her last brush with the strange. She and a girlfriend were at a club in the city when some people convinced them to go to a private house party. When they arrived, they found others there with strange, predatory eyes. One person claimed to be a vampire and made disturbing comments about wondering what their blood tasted like, trying to play it off as a joke. Sam's fiancée Sherry and her friend immediately fled to her car, with several people following them as they ran, speed walking behind them with these unsettling grins. After that incident, she became much more careful about where she went at night, on weekends, and with whom she spent her time. However, she continued to come into contact with almost all walks of spiritual beliefs. Eventually, she got involved with these Egyptian spiritualists and high masons and really started having serious problems. These people tried convincing Sherry to make an altar to call forth the ancestors, but but she wouldn't. Shortly after this, Sam and Sherry started having arguments more often, and his nightmares increased. He kept seeing this awful-looking, multi-appendaged black entity crawling up the stairs toward him. It looked exactly like the neighborhood devil from one of the drawings on the show, The Dead Files. At some point, she developed the ability to read Sam's mind by opening her third eye. All the while, they're fighting and arguing, and things continue to worsen. They had seen this large shadow in the back room that would open and slam the door. One night, while Sherry was working, some unseen force knocked her unconscious and she fell to the floor. Her spirit was torn out of her body, dragged up to the sky to the far reaches of space, and she was greeted by a second entity. Both of them grabbed hold of her by the arms and tried dragging her into blackness. At that moment, she called out the name of Jesus and instantly felt a strong hand grab her ankle, pulling her back into her body. When she came to, she was in a hospital bed, surrounded by coworkers standing there, staring at her, and it's unclear what happened to her or how long she was out of her body, but it physically shook her. Sam had enough after seeing that black shadow in the back room on multiple occasions, and after talking to Sherry, he convinced her to block all those spiritualists on Facebook and explained he would do a blessing to end all of this. An older gentleman she had been chatting with had written to her, telling her he wanted to get into her mind and soul. This was who was believed to be responsible. And doing what he had done in the past, Sam got a glass bottle of extra virgin olive oil, prayed over it for a blessing, went through the entire house, opening all doors and cabinets, and prayed over all the rooms closest to any open spaces. Sherry's ability to read his mind stopped too. Sam did a prayer blessing on her, an anointing of olive oil, and she felt a great heaviness lift off her. She felt lighter. Just before Sam closed the window in the upstairs bedroom, the one they had seen the shadow in before, a blast of cold air passed through them and knocked over a mirror, shattering it on the floor. At this point, everything seemed to normalize again for a while, but judging by what we know from Sam, things never normalized for long. Sam had to do an overnighter a few months later. He had a sleeper truck, and one night, he came home and he and Sherry had dinner and wine, and they were really tipsy. It was kind of a perfect romantic evening together, and they went out to the truck and did what couples do. And afterward, Sam slipped out of the truck to shower inside the house. Things were going fine. He got out and he was getting dressed, and all of a sudden, he heard screaming. He was trying not to panic because it was Sherry, and he opened the door, and Sherry came running up the stairs, all frantic and crying, and she ran into his arms and shivered and shook, and after calming down, she explained what happened. She had fallen asleep in the truck and had woken up to Sam's voice, but it was talking deep and low, but it sounded just like Sam, and she heard the door slam and felt his body weight shifting the truck. She called for him, but he didn't answer, and when she finally pulled the curtains back, she saw nobody was there. So she jumped up, ran into the house, and so Sam just did his best to comfort her. She eventually calmed down, showered, and laid down, and Sam went off to work. Not long after this, Sam and Sherry moved to a different apartment complex where their relationship continued to sour and they eventually broke up. Years later, after talking to his mother, Sam moved back to Florida. He thought things had changed after all these years, but he was wrong. He came back and slept in his mother's guest bedroom, his old childhood room. His white Pomeranian, a gift from his sister in Georgia, stayed in a cage with his mother's dogs in the kitchen. Not long after, his mother called him at work. His beloved Pomeranian Benjamin had passed suddenly, and somehow the veterinarian had no clue what happened to him. He was perfectly healthy and happy until just one moment. However, there were strange signs before his dog Benjamin had passed. Sam had dreamt of his passing beforehand, but obviously dismissed it. Now, talking to his sister Tiffany, he learned that his other sister Janelle and her husband had seen their father's ghost in the middle of the hallway one night at their mother's house. They freaked out and fled to a motel. Another time, his nephew from Georgia was staying in the guest bedroom and was creeped out hearing small footsteps and giggling going up and down the hallway while in bed. Eventually, his mother opened up about feeling something brushing her leg at times and feeling like someone big, like a man, sitting down on the side of her bed. She felt it was his father, and once she yelled and commanded what she thought was his father by his first name to leave and not come back. and the activity stopped. After years of study, Sam believed this wasn't his father, but a parasitic entity known as a familiar spirit. Now, we're going to fast forward in 2019. In the summer, Sam drove a local combination rock truck for a company based in Central Florida. The pay was lackluster, but he got home in a good time every day. After finishing up his pickups and deliveries, he got the call from dispatch to head back to the yard. So he went through Salt Springs and cut a right to head toward Ocala. At this point, the sun was starting to set, but there was still enough light out to see, and he was roughly halfway through the Ocala National Forest, right along the 314, heading towards State Road 40. Maybe it was his intuition about everything that had happened in his life, but something in him told him to look into his driver's mirror. When he did, he saw this huge black cloud in the shape of a triangle heading right towards him. Now, the clouds above were flowing roughly north or northeast, and he was heading southwest. He started to panic because he could see this thing flying in his direction, and it was clearly unaffected by any oppositional flow of clouds. He sped up to about 65, which seemed to match its speed. He sped up to about 65, which seemed to match his speed, steadily gaining on him. Now, he sped up to 75, and it was still gaining. 85, and it was still gaining. He could just feel inside his body that something really bad was going to happen, and all he could do was just call out to God and rebuke this thing over and over again, screaming and yelling. And as it got to about half a football field behind his vehicle, it suddenly dissipated. He gradually calmed down enough and backed off the gas pedal, trying to relax. Even more interesting is that the Ocala National Forest is already home to many Bigfoot sightings and other strange things, but let's get back to Sam. One night, while Sam was sleeping in his old bedroom, he heard something open the closet door and scamper out. Whatever this thing was, it climbed up the steps to the top bunk bed and started jumping up and down, squeaking the mattress springs. The room was pitch black and he couldn't see very well, but based on the sound of its movement, it seemed small, like a child, and walked on two legs. This exact same thing happened 3 different times. And he's pretty freaked out by these incidents, but despite everything that has happened to the entire family, he did not mention this to his 80-year-old mother because she was very dismissive. Instead, he just went straight to a camper dealership, bought a used camper, and parked it about 100 feet from the main house. He figured that would be the end of whatever was going on. With everything happening in the world at the time, Sam had decided to slowly build up an emergency supply, at least 3 months worth of non-perishables, like dried goods and canned foods, in case grocery shopping became difficult. And he stored everything in the camper's compartment, including 10 gallons of emergency water and a large bag of dry dog food. One day, he checked the supplies in the storage area, which could only be accessed by lifting the bed or unlocking a small side door on the camper. What he found made no sense. When he opened the storage compartment, there was some really bizarre damage. 2 of his favorite brand gallon water jugs had been bitten into, and literally bitten. In the corners near the handle, there were these quarter-sized bite marks, like something with very sharp teeth had chomped right through the plastic. Whatever did this had drunk about half the water from each jug, and the containers were kind of partially collapsed on top, like they'd been squeezed with tremendous force. This was definitely no accident. But what was even stranger was that all the other water jugs were covered in this brownish, sticky spattering, almost like snot or spittle, but nothing had damaged them. The dog food bag had about a half dozen of those same bite marks, with something clearly eating through each hole. After seeing this mess, Sam did an absolutely thorough job of searching the entire compartment. He checked it from the side, then lifted the bed to inspect all the way to the back. There was no way anything could have gotten in there. No holes, gaps, nothing. He checked multiple times. And mind you, his camper sat a couple feet off the ground over dirt with no brush around it. There's just no visible entry point. Interestingly, over the previous week, Sam had occasionally woken up around 3 in the morning to the sound of something knocking around in that storage area. One night, he had heard something small and bipedal running across the roof. It seemed to be messing with his air conditioner, and after it leapt off, the unit started making this irritating rattling sound that would echo through the camper and make it hard to sleep. After that, he kept having to clean black mold out of it. Eventually, the air conditioner blew, and he bought a new window unit. There was one time while on the phone discussing spiritual warfare, something big banged into his window and began howling and screaming. It sounded to him like a cross between a screaming child and a baboon. It was unholy, and it freaked him out. He had never heard anything like it before. He didn't open the blinds to see what it was, but later, after walking the property, he heard similar sounds and saw a huge, intimidatingly large owl that had taken up residency in one of their trees. It had these ink-black eyes and harassed him often at dusk and around 3 in the morning. These sounds always happened at night when he'd wake up in that kind of Twilight Zone stupor, but eventually things would quiet down and he'd fall back asleep. Most frightening, though, was one night he woke up to hearing knocking under his bed. Then he distinctly heard this loud, muffled "hello" coming from underneath. Whatever was down there sounded like a child trying to imitate that famous Seinfeld episode where he says hello. Sam completely freaked out. He jumped out of his bed and ran to the camper's kitchen area. And he stayed up until sunrise just sitting and thinking, what in the heck? When daylight finally came, he gathered enough courage to check under. But just like before, there was nothing there. He checked the side door again. Still locked. No way in, no way out. Now, as weeks went on, things did quiet down for a bit. However, one evening, Sam went for a walk and lost track of time. And when he realized how late it was, he knew he had waited too long to shower and go to bed. It was late December, so sunset was happening around 5:30 or 6. And by this time, he made it back towards his camper from the back property, and it was getting pretty dark. Plus, it was a cloudy evening. Now, for context, there's a storage shed by the rear of his camper and a shed next to it that houses the farm tractor. Between them is this small gap that creates a kind of dark alley. And Sam heard this low, high-pitched snickering and laughing as he passed this little alley. Looking over, he saw a shadow of something in that dark spot. Because of how dark it was, he couldn't see it clearly, but it was only about 1 to 2 feet tall and had the outline of what looked like a pointed-eared gremlin head and body. When he saw that, he just felt chills go over his entire body. He completely freaked out, ran to his camper, slammed the door behind it, and locked it. He just kept cursing himself for staying out so late on that property. Well, eventually, he found this Choctaw lady who was also an archaeologist who talked about all different kinds of entities, like fairies, elves, gnomes, gremlins, other nasty little things like puckwudgies, brownies, and stick Indians. They could all turn invisible, move through walls, going from spirit form back to solid when they want to eat, drink, or affect things in our space and time. Since then, he does not go out walking late anymore, not after dark. Now, not long after all of these previous events, Sam dreamed of seeing a bushel of bluish-purple flowers one night, but the flowers did not burn. He woke up confused about what it meant, but ended up throwing it in the back of his mental Rolodex and going to work. We can probably guess from everything in this story that his dreams tend to come true, and it happens that a week later, that home in New York, the home he grew up in, the home that his sister rented out, everything that was going on in that home, it burned down. Even though the outer structure held up, the interior was completely gutted with fire all the way to the rooftop, where a huge burn hole could be seen at the peak of the house in cell phone photos. By this time, the house had a second level built and a new attic after a remodel. His nephew, who was living there at the time, woke up just in time to alert his parents, brother, and sister's family to leave the house. They all survived. Afterward, Janelle and her family had to rent a house. She took many pictures and recordings of the damage, but one stood out. Inside the middle of the home, in the nook near the staircase leading up to the second story, perfectly intact and not burned on a stand, was a big vase. It was a gift to her from their step-grandmother many years ago before she died, and the vase was decorated with bluish-purple flowers, just like Sam had seen in his dream. Was her spirit there protecting that area in the house, or perhaps influenced his nephew to wake up early, getting everyone out of the home mere seconds before the house was engulfed in flames? We'll never know for sure. Even though she was the one who gave Sam's sisters the Ouija board many years ago, it's doubtful she planned to deliberately cause their family so many problems. This wasn't even an old Ouija board. Their step-grandmother had bought it new as a novelty gift. And after all, it is the old, frequently used boards you have to worry about. After a short investigation into the fire, nothing was conclusively found as to the exact cause. They did conclude one thing, though. The fire started, in all places, the basement. Sam believes whatever entity or energy resided in that house hadn't come through the board, the board had simply awakened something that was already there. Allegedly, that neighborhood was either built on or near an ancient Native American burial ground. So make of it what you will. The fire must have purged it. Many people do use Ouija boards that don't have horrific experiences like Sam's family did, and it's possible that where it's used has a part to play, but most importantly, the board opens up a doorway for things to pass through and attach themselves. There's a reason that people should be taking it seriously. Sam has been alive until now. He appears well for the most part, and he and I often correspond. Additionally, there's so much more information and so many other stories. I wasn't able to fit everything in this episode, but I feel like this does a really good job of conveying Sam's journey. And because you guys made it this far into the video, I want you to all comment below, wow, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into just wild cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.